It's 7:04-ish on my clock, so why don't we just start, and you know, if folks are arriving a little bit late, that's okay, we can get them all caught up. But my name's Camille Wimbish. I am with an organization called Ohio Voice and the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance, and I'm so pleased to be with you today to talk about the redistricting puzzle. Where do courts fit in? We've got a lot of great folks on the line today, and I'm excited to sort of talk about this. You know, clearly we're hearing lots about redistricting this year, and this is a hot topic, and I know folks will have lots of questions and some great dialogue. All right, well, so thank you today. Thank you for tonight's co-sponsors. We've got the Ohio Conference NAACP, the Ohio A. Philip Randolph Institute, the Fair Districts Coalition, all who are co-sponsoring this event and helping to get their members involved and educated on this issue. And it's so wonderful to be among some great friends. Today, I've got a great team. I've got Catherine Terser, who's here, who's going to be helping with, if you want to say something or wave, Catherine.
Hey, everybody.
We've got Mia Lewis from Common Cause, who's here, who's helping me with the slides. And we've got Jessica Dickinson, who's also our Fair Courts Outreach Manager, who's going to be helping with a lot of the tech as we go along. And then, so we've got, for folks who are sort of newer to our coalition, we are the Fair Courts Alliance. We believe in a court system that exemplifies and protects equity, fairness, and justice for all, which is so critical in this moment. Next slide. We have some amazing panelists for you tonight. We have Dominic Whitehead. Dominic is going to be first up. He serves as the Vice President of Campaigns, and he focuses on leading the association of the NAACP, their mobilization efforts across advocacy and electoral campaigns. He joined the NAACP in 2019 as the National Civic Engagement Director, where his focus was to increase African-American voter turnout through voter registration, voter mobilization, GOTV field efforts, and volunteer engagement. And then our second panelist will be Jessie Hill. Jessie is the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development and Law Professor at Case Western Reserve School of Law. Her background includes practicing First Amendment and civil rights law with a Cleveland law firm, and her research and teaching focuses on constitutional law, civil rights, reproductive rights, and law and religion. And then finally, to round out our panel, we have Dan Vicuña. Dan is a National Redistricting Manager at Common Cause National. He conducts research and provides legal communications and coalition support for Common Cause state organizations in their campaigns to implement redistricting reform. Citizen redistricting, he also manages Common Cause and amicus briefs for cases seeking to protect citizen-centered redistricting reforms and other redistricting cases. So all of these panelists have a wealth of information to share with you tonight, and we're also looking forward to hearing from you to hear what are some of your pressing questions. Next slide. So what we have planned for you tonight is first to do a quick sort of level setting, do a few introductory slides for some folks. I know some folks are like total redistricting geeks and are veterans at this, but we've got some other folks who may not be as versed in this. So we want to make sure everyone sort of gets the latest and greatest on what's happening. Then we're going to have some remarks. Each panelist will be speaking for about 10 or 15 minutes about their topics, and then we'll have a discussion. And last, leave you with some ways that you guys can get involved. All right, how's that sound? Okay, so Catherine, you're up first, and if folks are, thinking of questions as they go along, you feel free to pop them in the chat. I think Jessica will be grabbing some of those questions, and so when we get to the discussion part, we can make sure that we get those answered. All right, Catherine, take it away.
Well, I think for many of us, we're here because we are just disgusted with gerrymandering. And I think, we need to always look back and think about that original gerrymandering cartoon, which was from 1812. So this has been a long-term problem, and we have had gerrymandering since, before the Snake on the Lake or Jim Jordan's Duck District. And it's time for us to prepare for the map making this year. And that's why we're gathered here today. But that notion of the manipulation of the district lines for partisan advantage or to dilute minority vote, those are the kinds of conversations that we're going to be having today. So as we think about the intersection of the courts and gerrymandering, we need to keep in mind just how powerful the manipulation of those district lines have been over the years, and that both political parties have engaged in it. So sometimes it's the Democrats, sometimes it's the Republicans. And this is the year where we get new district lines. And so if you're ready to move to the next slide, the other thing is this year, we've been waiting. First of all, we worked to pass state legislative redistricting reform in 2015, and we worked to pass congressional redistricting reform in 2018. And we are so ready for the map making. And yet the pandemic came along, and I think it's important for us to think about, everything in context. But this is an unusual map making year simply because we have new rules and we're not exactly sure what's going to go and going to happen, because we're getting we're getting that census data later than we expected. And so Jessie's going to walk us through that. And then if you're willing to move the slide along, I also wanted to highlight a couple years ago, so it would have been the end of June of 2019, we were all on pins and needles, and we were watching to see what the Supreme Court was doing. In fact, we were on that SCOTUS watch. And it was because we wanted to find out whether, in fact, there was going to be a clear repudiation of gerrymandering. The Supreme Court had heard from about a North Carolina gerrymander, and so that's the Rucho v. Common Cause, and Lamont v. Benesek, which is the Democratic gerrymander in Maryland. And what happened is not what we expected at all and what we'd hoped for, but essentially the Supreme Court said, hey, this is not going to be under the purview of the federal courts, that this is something that the state legislatures should address. We identify it as a problem, but there's not a role for the federal courts, which I think is, incredibly hard. But what we do know is the Ohio Supreme Court is going to be the court that's going to address any improprieties. And then finally, I just wanted us to think about, our history of majority minority districts. This is Congressional District 11, and this is our lone majority minority district at the moment. And I think it's important to think about, going back to Loos-Soaks and thinking about the importance of this district because of that history of diluting the minority vote. And this gives you a sense of, very quick overview of our history. But I hope this will set us up to hear from our panelists. First, we're going to hear from Dominik, who's going to walk us through everything from the Voting Rights Act to all of the different things that we should be thinking about this year. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Camille to give it to Dominik.
All right, well, very quickly, I'm going to hand it right back over to Dominik, who's going to talk to us today about the Voting Rights Act and how we can find equity between the lines. Dominik?
Thank you so much, Camille, and thank you for that opening, Catherine. Again, Dominic Whitehead, NAACP Vice President of Campaigns. Ask those to bear with me over the weekend. For some reason, I caught a small cold, so you may can hear it in my voice and in my sinuses, but I will make it through. But here at the NAACP, the National NAACP, first and foremost, we work closely with the Ohio State Conference there in the state in terms of all the work they're doing in the state around redistricting and all things democracy. But NAACP, it really is the theory of the case for us. And when we think about redistricting, we think about the Voting Rights Act in terms of the Black community. We know the Black community matters in this process. And we look at it at two ways, people and policy. That gives us a better life. When we think about people, it really is assessing the needs of our community to determine what really matters the most for people of color, particularly Black folks. But then also adding that with the policy advocacy piece to make sure that the community and the advocacy that we're focusing in on meets the needs of our community that gives us a better life. And that is our framework as we go into this redistricting cycle over the next year. We have four main objectives when it comes to redistricting at the NAACP that we're working with all of our states across the country. It really is the first one in terms of focusing in on drawing equitable and inclusive maps to ensure voters of colors have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. I want to say that one again. Equitable and inclusive maps to ensure voters of color have an opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. Change the rules where possible. Defend the rules when necessary. So lots of litigation. You think about NAACP and our general counsel office, lots of litigation. Unfortunately, we don't want to go through that, but we're already seeing that happen right now during this redistricting cycle and even this past census cycle. And then the last piece is really to advocate and agitate, shape the debate and create a political demand to make sure that we're going in the right direction and we're lifting up communities of color in this redistricting process, along with tying it into the Voting Rights Act. Redistricting the road to 2022. When we think about NAACP, there are three things that we're looking at on the road to 2022. There is the minority vote dilution, so packing and cracking for a simple term for folks. The Federal Protection of the Voting Rights Act, 1965. We're coming up on the 58th anniversary about a month and a half in August, and we're seeing what's happening across the country when we think about voting rights right now, and that is definitely impacted as well by redistricting as well. And then the focus on ongoing efforts, organizing efforts of communities of interest. So making sure that we're focusing on ongoing efforts throughout our process. But this is our redistricting road 2022. What is minority vote dilution? Next slide, please. And so here you see this wonky slide here with lots of colors and dots and maps, if you will. But what this is really showing is how differently maps can be drawn in districts. There are four ways to divide folks or divide 50 people into districts. And on the next slide, we'll be able to dive into that and what that means. And communities of color, practices commonly known as packing and cracking. As we just lifted up, it really is a cure to dilute the voting strength of the community. It dilutes the strength and the power that the communities of color should have in terms of electing folks that will represent them at their best interests. So when we think about redistricting has been used at times to prevent minority voters from gaining political power by drawing districts in a way that resulted in these voters having less of a chance of electing their candidates of choice. And you see this throughout the slide this evening because it's very important to lift up minority or people of color voters electing folks of their choice and folks that best represent their interests. This is also known, again, as minority vote dilution. It's commonly and can be seen which map drawers use techniques such as packing and cracking. Districts are drawn based on the cohesion of like-minded groups, but shapes the districts but shapes each of the districts as well. Next slide. What is packing? Again, these are big terms, but it's simple in terms of when we think through it as packing. Packing is a term used when minority voters are compressed into a smaller number of districts to waste their collective strength. I'll say that again. Packing is a term used when minority voters are compressed into a smaller number of districts to waste their collective strength instead of effectively controlling one district or more, getting real impact overall in terms of their vote value, if you will. An example is when map makers draw one district is over 90% of a single minority group, which is blue, when one could draw two districts equally at 50% a single minority group, when we think about packing. Next slide. What is cracking? Cracking, really simple. In terms of spreading minority voters thinly into many districts is known as cracking, splitting, and fracturing. An example of cracking can occur if three districts are created that have 40% of a single minority population. Again, an example of cracking, if three districts are created that have 40% of a single minority population in each. If the minority population were placed within one district, but there are 70%, the minority community would have an opportunity to be a candidate of their choice. We're seeing this in states like Texas. You guys have seen it in Ohio. We're going through this in real time right now when we think about packing and cracking. And then we tie in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I won't read these bullet points word for word when it comes to the Voting Rights Act. because we see the Voting Rights Act right now is currently under attack day in and day out. We've seen it in Texas, we've seen it in Georgia, we've seen it in Florida, we've seen it in Ohio, they've tried it in Michigan, and the list is going on and on and on in each state and in each of the states. And we're also now seeing it clearly at the federal level, when we're not seeing legislation passed to enhance and or to protect the Voting Rights Act. This is clearly important when it comes to guarantee the right to vote for everyone, but particularly people of color, and making sure that they have the right to vote. If you look at Bullet 2, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is widely considered to be the single most important federal statute protecting the right to vote. And again, it's so important when we tie in voting rights and how the redistricting process and even census, I know we'll talk a little bit about that a little later this evening, when we're tying these in, all of these are connected in so many ways when it comes to democracy and how we're focusing. Next slide. Again, this is more information around the Voting Rights Act. When we think about Section 2, when the Voting Rights Act was amended in 1982, that provides the voting process or requirement that results in the abridgment of the right to vote on account for the vote of a voter's race, color, or language. Minority status is unlawful whether or not an intent to discriminate can be proven. This is a huge piece of the Voting Rights Act. This is a piece that the NAACP that we are focusing in on day in and day out. This is a piece most folks know Senator Manchin. That is over in West Virginia that we're looking at now, and we're thinking through new language when it comes to expanding voting rights in general for people of color or just for folks in this country. Next slide, please. And again, here, and just looking here, and I know we'll be sharing this, I won't go through each of these cases. All of these are cases in terms of protections of the Voting Rights Act. These are cases that we've all have seen before, most recently, and in the past. And this is still happening day in and day out. We are currently in, I don't even know how many lawsuits that we are in right now in states across the country when it comes to the Voting Rights Act. But here on this slide, it just goes of many of the different cases that have happened over the years regarding Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Next slide. And then the last piece here, again, I won't go into full details. I know many folks are very familiar with the Voting Rights Act overall, but this really is the criteria for majority minority districts in terms of the Voting Rights Act. We see the minority group is sufficiently large and geographically to make up a majority in the minority group is politically cohesive. This means that the individuals that make up the group vote in similar patterns, they usually vote for the same candidates. And so this is what the Voting Rights Act lift up in terms of much of the stuff that we're focusing in on. Next slide. And again, this continues to goes into the criteria for the majority minority districts when it comes to the Voting Rights Act. Communities of interest. And so for NAACP, and we think through communities of interest, as I lifted up earlier, focus on ongoing efforts when it comes to independent redistricting based on communities of interest. So what is a community of interest? A neighborhood, community, or group of people who have common policy concerns and would benefit from being maintained in a single district, right? Focus of a lot of state efforts that are currently in HR 1, reflected in S1. Again, we just spoke about HR 1 and S1 a moment ago. It's not currently moving, but it's something we hope to see happen in the near future. But would be a big step forward in preventing extreme intentional minority vote, dilution, and helping to mobilize communities. I just saw someone in the chat say they like the cartoon or like the graphic here. Don't be left out. Draw your own community of interest map for redistricting. We are at NAACP in the process of training folks in Ohio, our members in Ohio, but people across the country in terms of how to draw maps and being a part of those conversations to make sure that you are not left out and you're not at the table, or that you're at the table and no one is making decisions for you in terms of gerrymandering or drawing districts and drawing lines and when it comes to redistricting. However, this approach isn't a guaranteed fix for racial exclusion. We know this isn't a guaranteed fix. Communities or colors are clustered in cities while their white counterparts are more spread out in rural areas. That means that an approach centered on compact community-based districts that does not take demographics data into account will produce unintentional racialized gerrymanderings. That's something we don't want to see. That's something we have to focus on, keep an eye on, and keep a temperature check on. Pennsylvania, for example, will likely look the same way it does now, heavily skewed towards white voting blocks. We think about Pennsylvania, you think about Allegheny County, you think about the city of Philadelphia, right? Huge minorities, African-Americans, people of color packed into those counties, but the rest of the state of Pennsylvania is clearly rural or very white. So when we think about that, Pennsylvania is a great example of racial exclusion. I know we went through this rather quickly and there was a lot of information, but we have launched our redistricting campaign here at the NAACP, our national campaign. But for additional resources, folks can email me directly at dwitehead@naacp.net, naacpnet.org. You can also go to our website, naacp.org. There's an entire democracy page. Lift it up on a new website that we just launched a few months ago that dives into redistricting and much of the work that we're doing across the country, but also some of the work that we're doing directly in Ohio as well. Thank you, and I don't want to take up too much more time.
Thank you, Dominic. Quick question. We had a question from Hari, who was wondering if membership was open to other constituencies like Asian Americans or Hispanics.
Absolutely. We are an exclusive organization and we want everyone to be a part of the NAACP. So anyone can be a member. If you go to our main website, you'll be able to sign up to be a member. Ohio is an amazing state to be in and to be a member in, and a strong state conference there in the state of Ohio. So we encourage everyone there. Tom Roberts, our state conference president, many of you may know, would love to have you to be a part of the Ohio State Conference in NAACP.
Welcome, wonderful. All right, well, let's shift on over to the census, and we're going to hear from Jessie Hill.
Yes, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with this fabulous group. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. So I want to talk about the census. Of course, 2020 was a census year and a very strange one at that. And so why does it matter and what impact does it have on redistricting, and specifically what is the controversy around it in Ohio? So that's what I'm going to touch on here. Great. So what is the census and why does it matter? Well, the census is accounting, right? It's an enumeration. It's accounting of how many people we have in the US, where do they live, and gathering certain other demographic information about them. Why does it matter that we gather this information? Well, first of all, the number of people you have in a state helps to determine how many congressional districts you have. And because the Electoral College, your electors are also determined based on congressional districts, also the number of electors you have. So that's a very key aspect of the census. In addition, the census is important for Voting Rights Act compliance, which we can talk a little bit more about. We already heard some, but that demographic information can help figure out if the districts are in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. And then as federal funds are often allocated based on a district's population. And finally, researchers rely on census data as well to, study things, sociologists, folks like that, geographers, and so on. So click, yes. So I'm a constitutional law person, so I like to start with the Constitution, and I'll just note that the census is required by the Constitution, which says in Article 1, Section 2, that that an enumeration of the U.S. population needs to be conducted every 10 years in such manner as Congress directs, which means that Congress can pass laws and delegate to agencies the authority to make rules about how we conduct the census. In addition, the 14th Amendment requires that the equal protection of the laws, which forbids racial discrimination in the redistricting process, and also requires the counting of the whole number of persons in each state. That is the language that's quoted there, the whole number of persons in each state. So this is obviously, or you can probably assume, this is an enormously complex process to gather this data and then to put it in a form that is usable by states when they then turn around and draw their districts, both for their state legislative bodies as well as for Congress. So it's a process that, there are years of planning that go into this every 10 years. And this enormous document of how it's going to be carried out. So there's a multi-stage process where first the information is gathered through these questionnaires. This year was the first year, I believe, where it was done online as well. And then there is follow-up in person, people knocking on doors, trying to get information from folks who didn't answer. And then after all that information is gathered, then there are two kinds of data that are produced and given to the states so that they can carry out this redistricting. First, there is something called apportionment data. And what that is, that's the more simple sort of version of the data, although already before that's produced, there's kind of all this cleaning up that has to be done, redundancies removed from the data, making sure it's accurate, if there are overcounts, undercounts, figuring out, how to correct for that. So, but basically the apportionment data tells us how many people there are and basically where they live. And this is used for figuring out primarily how many congressional districts you get in your state. And then there's a second phase that's called redistricting data that is more refined. It's census block level data. It includes demographic information, including racial and ethnic identity. And it's used, it's more precise, and it's used for actually drawing the district lines, as well as ensuring compliance with the Voting Rights Act. So next slide. So there are deadlines, both at the federal level and at the state level, for conducting this process. And I'll talk about the state ones in a minute, but the federal ones are set out in a statute. And the statute provides that in a census year like 2020, December 31st, 2020 is the date that the apportionment data has to be provided. And then March 31st for the redistricting data. Now, what actually happened this year, as you might be aware, there was a bit of a pandemic this year. And so as the census was just getting underway, really, on March 18th, 2020, it was suspended due to COVID. And the Census Bureau announced that it was going to put out new deadlines of April 30th and July 31st for producing this data. So pushing them back about 4 months was what they anticipated. Meanwhile, in July of 2020, the Trump administration announced a policy to exclude undocumented immigrants from the count. And you might recall that language from the Constitution that basically you are just supposed to count the number of persons, right? Whole number of persons in each state, not, it doesn't say anything about citizens or citizenship status. Nonetheless, this was the policy of the administration, saying we're going to ask for a count that includes only folks who are have legal immigration status. And then turned around and said, forget about COVID. We're going to push to complete the count by the statutory deadlines. And as you might have already put together, presumably that is because the administration, if it was completed by, if the apportionment data was available by December 31st, whatever had happened in the November election, they would have time to make sure this policy was carried out, because the new administration, if there was going to be one, they didn't know that in July, the new administration would not be able to, change course at that point, not coming in until January, of course. So this is not on the slide, but this policy, and speeding up of the census, speeding back up of the census was challenged in court. Actually, a case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in December of 2020, the Supreme Court issued a very short opinion saying, oh, sorry, you may or may not have had valid reasons for challenging this decision by the Trump administration, but you plaintiffs who brought this case did not have standing to bring it. Therefore, the case is dismissed. So standing is something we can talk about more if you want. It basically means you have some sort of legal injury that entitles you to bring a legal case, so that you can say you were injured by this policy. And the court basically said, it's too speculative. You haven't shown that you are really harmed by this decision. Also in the background, the whole time this is going on, this decision was December 18th of 2020. In the meantime, Census Bureau is saying, we can't do it anyway. It's just not going to happen. You're not getting your data. You can say it all you want. You're not getting your data by December 31st. So the Supreme Court sends the case away, but turns out December 31st comes and goes, and Census Bureau is not done. They're not done. They're not done. They don't have the data. Finally, the data was delivered, the first round, the apportionment data on April 26th of 2021, after the process was accurately carried out. And then August 16th, 2021, as you already heard, is the anticipated date for the redistricting data. So next slide, please. Have deadlines ever been missed? Is this the worst thing in the world, that the census is late, that the data is late? It's not. It has. In many past occasions, many past census years, the data has been late for one reason or another. The statutory deadlines have been missed. Sometimes Congress just retroactively extends the deadline. Things happen, humans make mistakes, and the world did not come to an end. So what's going on in Ohio? Next slide. Yes. Okay. So Ohio has its own set of deadlines and its own processes and provisions. And I don't think, given the time that I want to go too much into detail, there's a lot of detail to how the redistricting is going to occur in 2021, because we had 2 constitutional amendments since the last census to our Ohio Constitution that lays out a process that is meant to be fairer and more transparent and more bipartisan than the prior process. So before those constitutional amendments, basically the legislature just drew the districts. And you can see how that might not be ideal, because if you have one party dominating the legislature, they have an incentive to entrench themselves and redraw the lines to favor themselves even more. And this then just perpetuates the pattern, right? So these constitutional amendments were passed to create a more bipartisan process. And they have their own deadlines, and they're different for the Ohio State General Assembly and the federal congressional districts. But basically, for the state districts, the deadline is September 1. It can be extended to September 15th. At the federal level, the deadline for drawing the districts and adopting a map is September 30th. But then there's this sort of series of cascading deadlines, October 30th, 31st, if they can't get it done by September 30th, and then November 30th, if that fails. And there's a sort of various other consequences that go along with it, including if they can't meet the deadlines through these bipartisan processes, they ultimately can adopt a map with just a simple majority vote, which is more likely to be a partisan map. But then if they do, that map is only good for 4 years and they have to redo it, as opposed to 10 if they follow till the next census, if they follow the bipartisan process. So, and then there are also, for the congressional districts, additional restrictions that apply around trying to avoid making a map that's too partisan. There was, and I think that I just noticed that a few minutes ago that this title is not ideal. It's not a legal challenge to Ohio's timeline per se. It's a legal challenge sort of based on Ohio's timeline, because as you probably noticed, those September timelines are going to be tough, actually impossible likely to meet if we don't have the redistricting data until mid-August to meet September deadlines. This is still a fairly complex process, right? So there was a lawsuit, you might have heard about it, where the state of Ohio actually sued the Federal Census Bureau in federal court to try to force it to deliver the redistricting data by the original March 31st deadline. The trial court dismissed again for this lack of standing, said you don't have an injury where you can claim you were harmed by the lack of data. And then also said, look, what do you want me to do? I can't order a party to do something it can't do. You know, they said they can't do it, they can't do it. That went up on appeal to the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And that court actually said, okay, we think the state actually does have standing, can bring this lawsuit, sent it back and said, just please deal with it quickly. A week later, the state actually reached a settlement agreement with the Census Bureau, where the Census Bureau said it will deliver the data by August 16th in this so-called legacy format, meaning not in the ideal user-friendly format that they might want, but they'll have the accurate raw data. So just last couple points to make. What's next? Well, you know, redistricting hasn't begun yet. The process has to, first there has to be a map adopted, right? And as I noted, there are these kind of cascading deadlines and different consequences if you fail to meet them. Look, a legislature could extend those deadlines. A court could extend those deadlines. You know, it's not even clear you really need a formal extension process. Again, things happen, they've happened before. They could be retroactively extended. The state does have, or the state Supreme Court does have, quote, exclusive and original jurisdiction over redistricting disputes that arise under the Ohio Constitution. So if there's a question about whether the Ohio constitutional provisions were complied with, that would go directly to the Ohio Supreme Court, wouldn't go through the lower courts, and could only be heard in the Ohio Supreme Court. If there's a claim that it like violates the Voting Rights Act or something like that, that could still go to the federal courts because that's a federal law. But on the whole, you know, so there's plenty of opportunity for, there's still lots of controversy, plenty of opportunities for courts to continue to be involved here, and I would say expect it, right? I think that the key takeaway that I just want to leave you with is the idea that, you know, stuff happens. We've got to recognize that deadlines get missed. It's unfortunate, but deadlines are not the most important thing in the world. There are other values like accuracy, fairness, transparency, and respecting the intent of the really the popular will that led to the adoption of these constitutional amendments as well, and the process that they were meant to create, and allowing that process to play out. So we'll see whether the courts and other decision makers end up agreeing with that view about what's really important here. And I think I have one last slide, and that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessie. I saw we have a number of really detailed and interesting questions. We will get to those once we finish with Dan's presentation, okay? So hold tight. All right, Dan, take it away.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to kind of walk you through the several different categories of court cases that are sort of demonstrate the different ways that the judicial branch in the states and the federal government will be involved in redistricting, is currently involved in redistricting, and will be going forward. So let's take a quick tour. I'd say the first bucket relates to kind of one of the last points that Professor Hill was making about some changes in the schedule to the delivery of redistricting data from the Census Bureau. As she mentioned, sort of, unprocessed raw legacy data will be released by August 16th. Sort of more fully baked data will be released by September 30th. And this puts a lot of states around the country in a bit of a bind. They have constitutional requirements for completing redistricting, and there's really no mechanism and no time to amend their state constitutions in time to make those fixes. So states have taken sort of different approaches, including going to the courts. In California, there was pretty much a friendly lawsuit in which all parties kind of agreed that this pretty strict deadlines that would have made it impossible for the Citizen Commission to complete the work, that had to be moved. So the state Supreme Court granted an extension of time, ensuring that the Citizen Commission here, and I sit in California, by the way, has 4 months to after the data is delivered to complete redistricting. The concern there, of course, is to ensure that people have plenty of time to participate in the process, give feedback. In Oregon, there was a case there as well brought by the legislature. Slightly different motivations. The legislature was concerned by a constitutional provision that would have handed power to the Secretary of State if they didn't draw their state legislative districts in time. Of course, no legislator wants that. So they filed for an extension with the Oregon Supreme Court, which was granted to shortly after, maybe about a month after the completed fully baked data is delivered. In Michigan, you have slightly more contentious litigation related to this. Although the data will be delivered, technically in time for the newly created Citizen Commission to draw districts there. It's going to compress that time for public feedback, and really community input is at the heart of why we create alternative mechanisms for redistricting. But there is some opposition from legislators who are hostile to the commission. So that's going to go to oral arguments pretty soon. So that's one bucket, sort of dealing with the deadlines. Another bucket concerns which data to use to draw districts. So I'm going to start by going to Illinois. A few weeks ago, the Illinois General Assembly, which has a supermajority of Democrats and a Democratic governor, decided to draw districts using some sort of combination of American Community Survey data and some other kind of proprietary information, we think, with a partisan redistricting consultant. Their purpose in doing this was to avoid one of the goofiest tiebreaker processes you will ever hear of. Let me just tell you how it goes. If the legislature fails to draw its own districts by June 30th of the year ending in 1, the process will go to a bipartisan commission, and the tiebreaker chair of that commission will be chosen by a draw from a replica of Abraham Lincoln's stovetop hat. That's some good sort of cocktail chatter for you at your next party. So obviously the legislature, fearful that Republicans could control the process in a place where they dominate the politics, did not want that to happen. So they drew districts using some non-census data. The problem is we're not quite sure about how good that data is. So coming out of that were 2 lawsuits, one brought by MALDEF with concerns about the state's growing Latino population, kind of concerns that American Community Survey data will undercount that growing population. And a second case brought by Republicans who obviously want to get a shot at that charming tiebreaker process so they might control the process. Next, I'm going to move to Colorado. There was a case there where legislators, they sought to pass a bill allowing the commission to draw some preliminary maps using non-census data. And they also sought to mandate an end to prison gerrymandering. What they wanted to do was tell the commission that you have to allocate imprisoned people in their previous addresses, not where the prison is located. That's what happens there is you sometimes see a distortion of population, distortion of sort of district populations. However, the court in Colorado ruled that the commission is independent under the Colorado state constitution, and therefore the legislature couldn't tell them what to do. So we're still making the push that the prison gerrymandering provision is worth doing, but according to the law, they don't have to do it. And finally, a case out of Alabama in which the state sought to prohibit the Census Bureau from using differential privacy. That's what's basically an infusion of kind of noise into the data, just to protect people's privacy, ensure that you can't look at census data and sort of take steps to identify an actual individual. And in addition to the Ohio case that Professor Hill discussed, also forced them to move up the date when data is going to be delivered. So the federal court denied the state's request there. There's another bucket of cases, which is about predicting a failure to draw maps. There are 3 cases in states that have split partisan control of government. In Louisiana and Pennsylvania, you've got a Democratic governor, a Republican-led legislature. In Minnesota, you have a Democratic governor, but the state Senate and state House are controlled by different parties. I won't go into detail on all 3 of them, but I will kind of illustrate the challenges and opportunities that come up by looking at Minnesota. Right now, there's 3 lawsuits in the state. They're almost certainly going to be consolidated into one. One's by sort of folks that are really close to state Democrats, as the DFL party there, one in which they're close to Republicans, and one brought by sort of national Democrats. You know, our concern is sort of where the public will fit into this process, where people of color will fit into the process in a state in which most population growth has been driven by people of color. So we're looking very closely at the best way to get involved and ensure that the court hears from all voices. I'll go to another category is challenges to sort of alternative processes from the legislature. You know, a big movement in reform, and in Ohio included, is to reduce the partisanship in the process. There are 2 cases that have been consolidated out of Michigan that are a challenge to independent citizen redistricting commissions. IRCs, as we call them, are bodies which are made up of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, also some independents, and ensuring that there's a sort of long list of conflicts of interest that keep sort of political insiders off the commissions, you know, to exclude recent elected officials and candidates, political party insiders, lobbyists, those sorts of folks. There's actually a challenge to that, claiming that political insiders have a constitutional right to gerrymander our districts. So far, that's failed at the trial court. That's failed in the Sixth Circuit twice. So we're keeping an eye to see if there will be a Supreme Court appeal there. And the last bucket that I'll talk about is likely challenges to final maps. You know, as we've been discussing, right, none of the states have final data, so there's no final maps. So this is a little forward-looking. But there will absolutely be challenges to racial gerrymandering. Dominik talked about the packing and cracking of communities of color. The Supreme Court, you know, that has struck those down, and I assume we'll see challenges like that again in this cycle. Challenges to partisan gerrymanders under state law. There are 28 states that have something called free elections clauses that, you know, Common Cause and our allies have used in a couple of states so far. Pennsylvania to strike down congressional districts, North Carolina to strike down both congressional and state legislative districts. And I'll also add in North Carolina, the trial court there also struck down the maps on some other state constitutional provisions, the provisions that kind of mirror equal protection, First Amendment. So it'll be really interesting to see what kind of the next phase, what the vanguard of legal challenges are in the states to partisan gerrymanders. And although Ohio is not one of the states with free and fair elections clauses, the reforms passed in both issues one, is it like attorneys general? Issues 1 created some stronger protections in the courts that help plaintiffs challenge bad maps. So that's kind of the long and short lay of the land. Happy to take questions in the Q&A section. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you for those remarks. And now I think it's time to open it up to some general discussion and lots of questions and interesting comments in the chat. So let's get to it. Jessica, do you have any good ones for us?
Oh, yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica. I'm the outreach manager for the Fair Courts Alliance. We've got a lot of great questions. I am going to start. Dominik, I've got one for you here. How do communities of interest or our community map making work impact litigation strategies, either through the Voting Rights Act or another type of challenge?
he was a little under the weather. Dan, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think what we're going to see as the sort of science behind gerrymandering has improved, what we've learned is that legislators, those who seek to draw districts based on partisan advantage, to discriminate on racial grounds, know how to make districts look pretty. You know, I think a lot of ways we focus on the shapes because, of course, it's an interesting visual representation of a symptom of a gerrymander, but it's not always sort of the definitive proof that there is one. So, you know, what we know is that districts can look pretty and draw straight lines and sort of ovals or whatever, and excuse me, and can still cut right through communities that need representation in order to have a voice in the halls of power. So hearing from communities who, you know, may represent interests of all sorts. You know, of course, I think first many of us go to sort of racial, ethnic, and language communities, but there are also communities of interest that are involved around environmental issues, looking at a certain water source, certain transportation routes, maybe who, you know, work for a certain industry and, you know, may all kind of live near each other for that reason. And, you know, decision-making bodies and courts need to hear those stories in order to know whether a map has been drawn for nefarious purposes, whether it's ignored the will of the people, and to give courts, if they're able to take that power to draw districts, you know, information they need, the justification they need to fix the districts in a particular way. So that community input is hugely important.
Thank you, Dan. Dominik, if you are still with us here, maybe you could talk about what advocates need to know to help create viable lawsuits when it comes to the community map-making work to impact litigation.
Can folks hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Sorry about that. I think great question, Jessica. Thanks for that. I think what advocates should know when it comes to the lawsuits portion, I would say first and foremost, folks should already be working directly in coalition or collaboration and partnership with legal groups directly in their states or their localities. I think oftentimes this stuff can get really, really wonky. I think when it comes to the lawsuit, so making sure that you are working directly in collaboration with groups who have legal expertise. So for instance, NAACP has legal expertise at the national level as well as the state level. We're working right now with the Lawyers Committee, for example. We're working right now with the Advancement Project on a few pieces when it comes to lawsuits. But then also we're doing trainings open to the public around when it comes to litigation and if there needs to be any lawsuits and or any type of litigation. So we have open trainings that we're doing nationally that we're working with our state conferences. And I believe we have an Ohio one coming up right after the 4th of July holiday. And I'll get it over to this team here so we can push that information out so folks can know how folks are coordinating directly in the states. But the first thing I would say, the most important thing in terms of advocates, if you are not a lawyer, do not pretend to be a lawyer. With your organizations, legal counsel, general counsel, and or groups, or there are many legal groups on the ground who are doing litigation when it comes to redistricting day in and day out. And I think you work directly with those groups there.
Great. Dominik, while I've got you here, another question is, where is Ohio's redistricting process in relation to other states? Do you know?
In terms of NAACP or just in general?
Both, if you have it.
So in terms of, I'm not quite sure fully for Ohio in reference to other states overall, so I don't want to mislead anyone. But in terms of in general, when it comes to NAACP, all of our states for the most part are different, just depending on what's happening in the states, are at different places when it comes to the redistricting process. I do know we have a redistricting committee that I believe is led up by Tom Roberts and a few others there in the state. So they will have a tad bit more information in terms of what's happening statewide or locally there in the state of Ohio on that.
Thank you so much. Dan, Can you follow up on where Ohio's redistricting process is and related to other states, especially in terms of the Ohio Redistricting Commission hasn't been convened yet? What are
Okay.
other states? Where are they at?
Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry. Oh, so for Ohio, I would probably defer to Catherine, who's in the state. But you are sort of looking at other. Yeah, if you want to talk Ohio, I would look to Catherine, who I think is going to be more updated on that.
So I think the reason that this is a question is that the Ohio Redistricting Commission has not been convened. The state legislature has not started to hold public hearings or really done anything. And so there's this sense that we're going into this almost like the census data isn't here yet. We can just not worry about this. And it's made us progressively anxious simply because we have a sense that we have new rules. We have deadlines that are coming up that we can't possibly meet. And it's just not really clear, like, compared to other states, are they further ahead in their planning process?
Great, thank you. Jessie, I have one for you. What role do courts play in ensuring that map-making authorities use the appropriate data in redistricting and not use alternative data sets like the ACS or commercial data sets?
Oh, that is a great question. So, and others might want to weigh in as well. But it's so the constitutional amendments, the Ohio language actually does say to use federal data or other data that basically that the General Assembly approves, and so. That's one question. So for one thing, that's a question that could go to the Ohio courts or the Ohio Supreme Court, rather, interpreting what is really required and what is the intent of that language in those amendments. But I would say also, I think there's a real danger of sort of suggesting that they can just use whatever data they want, because if it's not good data, I mean, first of all, not only does that kind of undermine the purposes of the process, and the census data is really like the A+ gold standard data, but you may run afoul of the Voting Rights Act of like one person, one vote. I mean, if you're using garbage data, you are not going to be able to make sure your districts are complying with federal law. And then you could find that federal courts are also being called to weigh in on that. So again, this is something that may not come up right away. And I haven't heard, well, I don't know, others maybe have more information. I haven't heard that there's really been a push to use other data, but it would be a really bad idea, I think.
Yeah, I'll just add that, some states, like I mentioned, Colorado, where the Colorado Supreme Court sort of refused to allow the legislature to tell the independent commission that they had to use any kind of data in particular. And I think you're seeing, and we'll see how the Illinois challenge goes, because they used, sort of, again, kind of proprietary data combined with ACS. But sorry, if I just back up to the earlier question about some of where some of the other states are in the redistricting process. I mean, we are seeing states that are very far along. I mean, including maybe things we don't love, drawing maps based on bad data, but in other places you've seen commissions formed already. They've held several hearings, in Colorado and California and Michigan. So it does strongly suggest that it's really time for Ohio to kind of get going in the process, and hopefully they do soon, because we don't want this to be a squeeze process in which the population can't give quality input.
Great, thank you. Jessie, while I have you, we have another question. What do you make of the recent amendment to the state operating budget that says that only the Speaker of the House and the Senate President can intervene in redistricting lawsuits?
Right. It's problematic. So normally the state is represented by the Attorney General, who is sort of, at least in theory, supposed to have some independence and make decisions in the interest of the state. I kind of wonder if there are perhaps separation of powers problems with allowing, not just the legislature, but like one party within the legislature to make decisions like that, to intervene in a case. Again, I think we'd have to wait and see if that actually happens. But it just strikes me as a very bizarre way for the state to be involved, because the state's involved in lots of litigation and all kinds of constitutional litigation, and they always do it, they do it generally through the Attorney General. The legislature can file an amicus brief if they want to make their interests known to courts. Courts generally care what the legislature thinks, but having a kind of, guaranteed partisan representative is problematic, I think.
Thank you. Dan, what possible remedies do you see if Ohio's legislative majority takes steps to thwart the intent and spirit of the compromise plan from a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously avenues for procedural challenges if they don't follow the letter of the law or the sort of bipartisan spirit in which it was intended. I think there are very specific provisions aimed at drawing maps that are out of whack in terms of votes and the way those translate to seats. So, I think there will be the existing sort of federal court remedies if you see, kind of racial gerrymanders or other things that are illegal under federal law, but you also have some solid protections, of the sort of strong transparency and sort of bipartisan requirements of the law itself and state protections against partisan gerrymandering. So I think there will be definitely different avenues.
Thank you. Jessie, if the Ohio Supreme Court can extend the deadlines, can they do this before the deadline is passed, or does there need to be damage first? And if so, who has standing to bring the lawsuit?
I mean, these are all this is all uncharted territory. Again, if other folks want to express thoughts, I'll just say my guess, but we don't really have a precedent to point to on this. I mean, I think one thing about the Ohio Supreme Court and the Ohio Constitution is that it may be able to give a sort of declaration interpreting the state law. I'm hesitating because I'm about to say that there's sort of other ways of getting standing in state court that aren't as strict as in federal court, but it's not entirely clear that that's true. The law has shifted a little on that in recent years in the Ohio Supreme Court. So I don't want to oversell that point, but it's possible. There is language again in these constitutional amendments giving the Ohio Supreme Court jurisdiction to hear cases involving these amendments. That being said, I mean, I think they would still think they have to meet the requirements of standing and other legal requirements like that. So it's a big question mark. I don't know if I have other folks that have thoughts about that. I think we will find out. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. And
None
Jessie,
of us like being in limbo.
and Jessie, if we only get 4-year maps, what happens after that?
Oh yeah, they just have to they have to try to make new ones under the same procedure. And then, if they are able to make bipartisan maps and they last until the next census, and if they aren't, then it's the same process.
And Jessie, since I've got you, is there any chance Ohio could have more than one majority minority district?
So I don't think I know the answer to that. I don't know enough about the sort of data to answer that question specifically. I guess one thing I would just say is to keep in mind that it's, and again, maybe the voting rights, my co-panelists want to say something too, but that it's not always just about majority minority districts, that sometimes you can have a district drawn in a way that actually maximizes the voting strength of particular communities whether it's, you know, Blacks, whites, you know, Hispanics, whatever the demographic community is, without that group comprising a majority in the district, because there's enough sort of crossover voting that you don't need a majority to have a district that elects the candidate of choice. So, but I can't answer the specific sort of question about what the actual map could look like. I mean, I assume there could be more than
Sure.
one based on the.
Well, and just, I wanted to add this, and sorry, I'm jumping in like I'm a panelist, but I did want to add that it does look, based on the American Community Survey data that we have so far, that there won't be 50% African-American voters. So it will not be possible to, it may not, you know, obviously we're not getting the census data, we'll know for sure, but it may not be possible to do a majority minority district, but that doesn't mean you can't create an opportunity district, which is what Jessie was talking about, that notion that we could, you know, create, you know, much like when we think about Joyce Beatty's district. Joyce Beatty doesn't have, it's not a majority minority district, but there was enough African-American population to create this opportunity for an African-American representative going to DC to represent us all. Dan, did you have something you wanted to add to that, or Dominic?
No, I think you hit it on the head, Catherine, when it comes to that piece. And I think Joyce Beatty district is a great example of a district like that there in Ohio.
Yeah, I'll just add that, you know, we've seen it in the last, you know, few election cycles that the number of African Americans in one district required to, you know, generate a district in which, you know, Black voters can elect candidate of their choices has gotten lower and lower. And yeah, like Catherine was kind of alluding to, it's definitely below the 50% threshold that, you know, may require the Voting Rights Act to be invoked, but it's still, you know, a number of voters that, you know, decision makers should look at to give Black voters a chance to elect candidate of their choice.
Thank you. Dan, do you know how long it will take to make the August 16th census data usable for drawing maps?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know sort of time-wise. What I've been told is that a decent demographer can do it without too much problem, without much difficulty. I don't exactly know what that translates to in terms of time, though, unfortunately.
Thank you.
So Ohio University is suggesting it may take 2 weeks. So, I mean, obviously they're, you know, hedging their bets, but we're definitely gonna, if it's August 16th, we do know that we're gonna hit that first September 1st deadline, that it's just not gonna be possible.
Right. Thank you. And we have got a broader question here. Looks like this will be our last one, and I will leave it open to all of our panelists. The Supreme Court's approach in recent cases suggests a hands-off approach to gerrymandering claims that aren't based on race. What approaches do you see as potentially the most fruitful at either the state or federal level if the maps are gerrymandering or too many communities split?
Professor, or you want me to go? Up to you.
I'll start, and then you can give a a more complete answer, maybe. I mean, I think in Ohio, because we do have this language in our amendments that, you know, it requires that certain standards be adhered to, basically geared at not allowing hyper-partisan maps to be drawn. You know, that does open up some possibility of litigation in state court in front of the Ohio Supreme Court that could sort of vindicate those kinds of interests in having, you know, fairer, more balanced maps. There's a lot of question marks about how that's going to play out and how courts are going to interpret, how the court is going to interpret those provisions. And, you know, they're very mushy. It's very mushy kind of language. But I will note that the Ohio Supreme Court is more politically balanced than it has been in recent history. So, you know, that may have an impact as well. It may give reason to think that there are strategies, you know, for challenging extremely partisan maps. I don't think the federal courts are the place to look right now.
Yeah, I mean, you know, unfortunately, a couple of years ago, you know, there was the case Rucho v. Common Cause that we obviously brought in the hopes that the Supreme Court would strike down partisan gerrymandering as a violation of the Constitution. They declined to do so. Declined our invitation, despite how politely we brought it to them. So it looks like federal courts are going to be out of the business of dealing with partisanship in mapping. But like I kind of alluded to earlier in my presentation, that you've seen state constitutions possibly going to be on the vanguard of this new effort to go to the courts to protect against partisan manipulation through free and equal elections clauses, to provisions like Ohio's, to a ban on partisan gerrymandering, for instance, in Florida. And there's some other states that have language that really hasn't been taken out for a spin by litigators. So, you know, we'll be active and ready to use those.
Thank you to all of our participants for their great questions. I am going to give it back to Camille. We have some ways that we can tell you about of how you can get involved.
Great. I'll do one final call though. We tried our best to catch everybody's question. Does anybody else have a question that they want to toss before we close out? Or to our panelists, do you have any closing thoughts for us that you'd like to leave us with?
So we do have an action slide if Mia wants to pull it up. I wanted to highlight to everybody that Dan does this wonderful gerrymandering gazette, which what I would encourage you all to actually sign up for. And so what we'll do is we'll send you information about the Gerrymander Gazette, and every single week there's like a little bit of an update that gives you all sorts of good information. And also, I don't know if you got a sense that I was super duper annoyed by the fact that we still have not had, you know, the governor has not actually convened the Ohio Redistricting Commission. So if you want to, you can take out your phone right now and you can text DeWine to 97779. And what'll pop up is this ability to send an email to the governor saying, hey, please convene. It's time. We've been waiting. Or you can write a letter. And so this is one of those bit.ly links that's super short, and you can do that on your computer after you're done. Or you can actually place a call to his office. My guess is he's getting plenty of phone calls because of the budget. But I would encourage you to, you know, take some action and encourage our map makers to get started. And then there are many different good redistricting trainings. Dan, do you want to highlight anything about trainings galore?
Yeah, so Common Cause is part of a coalition called Charge that is made up of a bunch of different national groups that have a presence in the states. And we're doing one redistricting community college, which kind of all encompassing about learning everything about the process. And then we have more targeted trainings on districter, how to do community mapping, on the issue of prison gerrymandering, and a bunch of others. And they're free. We invite you to join and learn more and figure out, you know, kind of how to get involved, you know, at that bit.ly trainings galore that Catherine put up there.
Well, that all sounds like a fun time now, doesn't it? All right. Well, I just tried the text. It worked very easily, so that was cool.
Good.
Thank you for that. And excuse me. It looks like that's our last slide. We have a contact us for those who wanted to get more information. We're going to be sending up an email with the slides if you'd like to see them, a link to the recording for folks who may have missed it. Feel free to contact us and let us know how we can improve or how we can help or how we can be a resource to you. But we really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Dominik, fighting through that cold. Way to be a trooper. Thank you, Professor Hill. And thank you to Dan. And I wish you all a good night.
Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.